Welcome to The Art Box, your podcast dedicated to exploring the vibrant art scene in Nevada and beyond. Join us as we embark on a journey through galleries, theaters, studios, public lands, and streetscapes, meeting the artists, curators, archaeologists, nature lovers, and cultural influencers who shape our creative community and our world. Whether you're looking for your next cultural adventure, seeking inspiration for your own artistic pursuits, or simply curious about the world of art, tune into The Art Box. Together, let's open up a world of creativity and imagination. Let's dive in.
Dreams, what if the night is about you and me? So lift your head up.
Hey, so here we are this morning. Sandy, your last name's not really Randall, right?
Randelle is how I pronounce
Randelle.
it. No, it's Scheiterer, which is really hard to pronounce.
So that's why you go with
That's
the
why I
pen
go with
name
Randelle.
of
Yeah.
Randelle.
People murdering my last name my whole life, so I thought something simpler.
Yeah,
would be
well,
better.
you think mine is easy to say, but it's not. So they've been murdering mine.
Welcome, Sandy.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
And you're a Mesquite resident.
I am, yes. For
Awesome.
almost 5 years now, so.
Wow. Where were you before you came here, and what brought you here?
Oh, goodness, I've been all over the place. I was actually born in Florida, and my family's from Ohio, so I spent quite a few years there. And I came out west when I got a scholarship to Eastern New Mexico University. Did my undergraduate there, did my graduate work at UNLV. I met my partner in Las Vegas. We came here because his family lives in St. George, and so we wanted to be close to them. This was a good compromise because we didn't
Sure.
want to live in St. George.
Sure. Have you always been writing since you were little? We've had guests that come in and say before they even knew the alphabet, they had, when they were little kids, they had a pen and pretended to write. Did you do that kind of thing?
My dad taught me to read before I started school. I was a big reader. I read a lot of stuff. I always told stories. I didn't write them down. I had a friend who would call me and say, tell me a story, and I would just make something up on the spot, and he was just enthralled by them. And so when I moved to Ohio, I was in fourth grade, and coming from Florida to Ohio, in Ohio they'd already learned cursive, and we were still printing in Florida. The teacher gave me a workbook. And basically, I did self-guided, taught myself how to do cursive. I would turn it into her every week, and she would grade it and give it back. And I just got to love the feel of the pen, the paper, and doing that. My writing style ends up being a kind of a mix of cursive and printing, because there's certain letters that I can't do a cursive Q. I just can't do it. But I love the S's. I love, things like that. And I always have a stack of blank notebooks. I actually collect fountain pens, and I love to just to write. And I, of course, do most of my work on the computer now for convenience sake, but I still do write by hand a lot.
Yeah, that's changed a lot from writing by hand to typewriter to the computer.
Oh gosh, yes, yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the cursive Q now. I think
It's
really
really strange looking. Yeah,
I think that was really hard on me. I was marked. I didn't even think about that until you said it.
Yeah. L's are wonderful. L's are easy, but that Q with the little tail and it's very, very difficult.
Yeah.
I also mix printed and cursive letters together, and I read a long time ago that means something about your personality, but I don't remember, so I'm just going to assume it means we're brilliant and creative, right?
Yes, I hope so.
Yeah, I'm going to go with that.
Your first, you said you'd like to tell stories and write stories. When did you write your first novel?
Actually, that's an interesting story. The first novel that I completed was Of Dark and Bright, which is actually the second book in my vampire series. And there's a long story behind why that ended up being the second book. But Of Plight and Promises was the first one that I published. I published that in 2013. I had realized in Dark and Bright that there was something missing from the story, and I had to explain why certain of my characters acted the way they did and did things, could do things that others couldn't do. And that's where Plight and Promises came in. It's the origin story. And then Dark and Bright got rewritten a little bit to accommodate some things that happened in the first book. And that one came out in 2017. And then Chasing Shadow was just something I was playing around with. And when I finished it, I published it, and it came out in October of this year. And it's completely different from the other two books. But I'm currently working on the third vampire novel. That's the end of the trilogy. And that'll be out hopefully this summer if I can. It's a big book.
Wow.
So if I can manage to finish it by then, it'll be out. I managed to release the vampire novels on the same day, just a few years apart. And so that's my goal, is to release the third one on the same day as well.
Now, do you need to read your first two books before you read the third, or is it standalone?
Chasing Shadow is a complete standalone. You can read that
Right.
without reading any of my other stuff. The vampire novels, you should read them in order because, like I said, there's a lot of things happen in the first book that explain things in the second book, and the third book will be that way also. Also, the first book, Plight and Promises, is a very small cast of characters, and then you meet the extended family in the second book, and then the third book, I have a kind of a worldwide scope on this book. There's things going on all over the globe, and so there's a lot more characters, there's a lot more action, there's a lot more story involved in it. So I don't think you can go in cold.
I'm thinking there's so much involved in writing fiction. You know, you have to develop your characters and your theme and the setting. But I'm wondering, how'd you start writing vampire stories?
The main character of my vampire novels, Desirata, actually started out, I hung out with a group of people in college who did role-playing games every week, things like Dungeons & Dragons and Vampire the Masquerade and Marvel Comics, different games. And Desirata actually started out as my Vampire the Masquerade character. She was a Toreador, that was her clan. She was such an interesting character, and I've always been fascinated by horror movies, vampire novels, all sorts of things like that. So when it came time to write a vampire novel, she, of course, just kind of, organically became the center of it.
And I haven't read your vampire novels. I read Chasing Shadows. So are there rules that you set for your vampires? Or are there upper limits? Or are there some things they're good at and other vampires are better at? Or the relationship with humans, is that a good thing?
Oh, yes.
To be a vampire and have a relationship with a human?
Yes, my vampires don't follow the traditional rules. I've kind of created. There's a lot of things that they can do that, for instance, Dracula couldn't do, that Anne Rice's vampires couldn't do. And calling it just a vampire novel is kind of a misnomer. It's really more of a dark fantasy novel. There's some magic. There's some interesting things that occur. The first book actually centers around what happens when Desirata meets one of the Fae, which, I took that from Celtic literature and British mythology and the whole idea of the world of fairy being so close to our own. And so there's, like I said, there's some magic, there's some other things involved, and they do have very close relationships with humans. They manage to. They keep what they are secret, of course, from most of them, but they have to eat. So
Sure, yeah.
Well, that's why I don't think I'd want to be their friend.
They do interact with humans, but the humans seem to enjoy it. So
do they?
Yeah. So
Yeah, but don't they then turn into a vampire?
no. There's a process to that. It has to be.
Okay.
You have to intend to make. You can't just randomly make a vampire.
It's okay
in my
for you to
world.
say, Steve, read the book.
No, there's a process involved. So
that's a little different from vampire stories that I've heard, and you as well, Steve, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that gives us a little more hope as humans.
I guess. So writing dark fantasy, does that ever take an emotional toll on you, the writer?
Oh, I get very involved with my characters. I really do. They're like friends to me. They're very, very real. I know their personalities well enough to know how they would react in any certain situation or anything. I've gone back and reread, read my books, and there's things that make me cry and make me laugh, and it always surprises me that I have such an emotional reaction to my own books. I know what's coming. I've read it before. I wrote it, and so it's very personal to me. Writing is the goal is always to tell a good story, but you have to make characters that people can relate to. And Desirata is very unusual for a vampire. She's very much a humanitarian, and she's very connected to the people around her, and very loyal to them. My dad taught me that you could learn something from every book you read, whether it be a history book or a modern writer, fiction novel or something, even Stephen King, something like that. There's something in there that you don't know that the author is going to tell you. But he also just loved to read. He was always reading a dozen books at a time, and he had a little bookshelf set up next to his chair, and he would just pick whichever one he was in the mood for. And I developed the same habit. I'm always reading multiple books and of course writing them at the same time. So, but they're supposed to be friends. It's supposed to be like visiting people you care about when you go back and read a beloved novel.
Sure.
Yeah. So, and we can talk about when you write, how you write, but just assuming that you're writing during the day, and you go back to your partner, and he's sitting there enjoying a TV show, and you sit down in the chair. Are you emotionally drained? Do you go to sleep, or do you leave the book behind that you were just writing?
You know, just the act of creating the stories. I'll write something and I'll be very proud of a turn of phrase or something that I did in the story, and that it kind of energizes me a little bit. And I don't tell him how the book's going to end.
Okay.
I make him read it. He's my first and best proofreader, and he. There's a great story. There's an interlude in Dark and Bright. The interludes are kind of the historical chapters. Here's what happened before this story. And there's an interlude that I wrote that I was really proud of it, and I took it to him and I showed it to him, and he read it and he goes, "It's too easy." And I was like, "Too easy," and I got mad. And I went back into my writing room, and I sat there and I tore it apart and I rewrote it, and I didn't come out until it was done, and I took it out and I threw the pages at him, and he read it and he goes, "Yes, this is what you needed to do the first time."
Oh, so you appreciated that.
So I did, yeah.
You don't hate him anymore because
at the time I was mad. I was like, "What do you mean it's too easy? This is like really good." And then I read it and I was like, "No, I can do this and I can change that," and it turned out being much better. So
We all need a critic like that.
yes, he's always
Help us out.
very honest, and he's the reason that Chasing Shadow got finished as quickly as it did, because he read it and he said, "You have to finish this,"
Oh,
and so I
awesome.
did. So my focus has been on finishing this third vampire novel, and I was like, well, I don't want to do them out of order. He's like, "Finish that and then go on," and so I did, and I'm glad that I did. It turned out really well.
if you could live as one of your characters for a day, which one would it be? I know what you're going to tell me, or maybe not.
Maybe not.
And why?
Before Chasing Shadow came out, I would have said Desirata. I really would have, because she lives a fascinating life.
Oh, it's not fair that you pick out one of the ones from Chasing Shadows, because there's some badass females, and
I fell in
Chasing
love with
Shadows.
Silver when I was writing Chasing Shadow.
No.
And writing from a first-person point of view, which is something I had never done before. I always go third-person omniscient because I feel like you can tell more of the story that way. And I really had to get to know her in a way that I'd make a connection with her that I don't even have with Desirata for as long as she's been with me. It was just really interesting trying to determine how she would react in any given situation. And plus the idea, I was a big Star Wars geek when I was a kid. I was very into it. And the idea of being able to just get in a ship and fly to another planet and, see what it's like would be fascinating. So,
Would you like to tell us a little bit about your creative process?
sure. I think I mentioned I spend, of course, a lot more time on the computer now than I have traditionally. Most of my scenes will... When I sit down to write a book, I'll have an idea of the story that I want to tell, just kind of a basic overview of this is what's going to happen. This is the main thing. But the scenes develop very organically. I've had dreams that have turned into scenes. I've come up with ideas, in the middle of dinner, just things that occur to me, and I think, oh, what if this character did this? It's also, for me, most people think if you're going to sit down and write a book, you start on page 1 and you go all the way through to the end. And I did do that with Chasing Shadow because that's just the way the story developed. But with my vampire novels, with everything else I've ever done, I write the scenes as they occur to me. When I started Dark and Bright the first time, I wrote the beginning, I wrote the first chapter, and then I wrote the end.
Oh,
Okay.
wow.
And then as I was going along, scenes would occur to me, and I would write them. I would sketch them out or write them down, and then just kind of connect the dots from to get here to this scene, I need to do this, and then that. And so it was like a jigsaw puzzle, putting it all together.
Wow. That's a lot of problem solving.
But that all makes sense to me,
Yeah.
to write the beginning and then writing the end.
Yeah.
Do you think anybody could ever write the end and then go back to the beginning?
Well, with Plight and Promises, I knew how it was going to end before I ever started writing the first chapter. And I don't remember if I wrote the end before I wrote the beginning on that one, but I did write it very, very close to the start of the work. And that gave me something to work towards through the whole book.
So are you saying with Chasing Shadow that you had no idea how you were going to end it?
I knew how I wanted it to end, but I didn't know if I was going to get there. It was something, like I said, I started writing it. I have a deep love of sci-fi, and I started writing it just because the story occurred to me, and I always write down anything because you can always use anything that you write. And it just went from the very beginning when I started in Silver's voice and started talking, and then Theral came into the story, and it just flowed all the way to the end, and I knew... I like I said, I knew how I wanted it to end, but I had no idea how I was going to get there. I got stuck at one point about 2/3 of the way through the book trying to figure out there's a big scene, and I was trying to figure out how to get them there. And that's where Rye's voice comes in. That's the only chapter that she really speaks in the whole book, and that solved it. And then it was just full speed ahead straight through to the end.
Hey, so staying on this theme and asking Linda, because she's a great watercolorist and anything else brush art too. But Linda, when you start I didn't think about this until now when I asked Sandy. When you start your painting, are you looking at the end already? Do you know where you're going with the painting?
A lot of times I am, but that can diverge for me and change.
Especially if an eye is involved. That's
a joke because I've moved an eye 3 times on a watercolor painting, and it turned out. But and sometimes with painting, it takes on a life of its own and goes in a different place than I originally intended it to be. So it's like I'm an observer as well as a participant. Does that happen to you ever?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's been characters that I thought I knew how they were going to react at a certain point. And by the time I got to that point, I was like, well, no, that's not what they would do or what they would say. That's not how they would react to this situation. And it completely changes your tone and your direction to a certain extent.
Sure, I could see that. Tell me about being obsessed. To be a writer, you have to be obsessed.
My wonderful professor at Eastern New Mexico University, Anthony Oldnow, I took a postmodern literature class with him. And it was a very postmodern class. We had all these books we had to read, and he would come in and start by talking about whatever book we'd read, and the conversation would just go off into 100 different directions by the end of class, which in and of itself is very postmodern. But I remember him telling me, that's always stuck with me. He said, if you want to be a writer, you have to be obsessed. And I remember thinking, with what? You know, he didn't tell us with what. And I think now, in retrospect, that was the point. You have to find the things that you take joy from, that give you joy, and work that into use that as your inspiration, use that as your background for things. And that's why I write vampire novels, why I write a sci-fi novel, and these are things that I love. It just develops from there.
What about writer's block? I've stuck paintings in closets for years before I've pulled them out and finished them. Do you ever start something and you have to just totally put it away?
I've had times, especially writing this last book, because it is such a huge undertaking. I've had to walk away from it a few times and kind of take a break and then go back and reread what I've done. And in some cases, reread the first book or two to make sure that I'm keeping everything consistent. Like I said, when I get writer's block, I'll go and listen to some music, or I'm a big fan of video games. I was an Atari kid in the 80s, and
okay.
And the games today are so involved and so detailed. They're entire worlds in there. You can just go and get lost in them. And it's good to give your brain something else to focus on. But my subconscious is always chewing on whatever the problem is. It's like, how do I get this character here? Or how do I solve this problem that I've created for myself? Because you do occasionally write yourself into a corner and you have to figure out how to get out of it. My brain will let me know when it's solved the problem, usually in some dramatic fashion. You know, it'll just come to me all at once, and I'll be like, oh, and Max is very used to me getting up in, the middle of watching a movie or something, and I have to go write this down, and I'll go and write it all down. Because if you don't write it down, you're going to lose it,
yes.
And so you got to write it down, and you might remember part of it, but you might forget something important, and so you've got to write it down right then. So he's used to me. He just pauses the movie and waits for me to come back.
Do you ever dream?
Oh, yes. Oh, they talk to me. Yes.
I mean, so you may solve a problem in your dream and then immediately get up and head to the laptop.
There's I've been kind of playing around with the idea of doing a second shadow novel. It was supposed to be a standalone, but I've also had some friends and some reviews. People have said, you created this beautiful cast of characters. You have to tell the next story. There's always a next story. It was that kind of thing. I had a dream just a couple of weeks ago, actually, of who a certain group of people were. And I've mentioned Xanadu in that book, and I was trying to figure out who was in control of Xanadu, and they showed up in my dream, and I know who they are now. And so I wrote that down, and hopefully that'll become a scene, and there'll be a second book, because I do think there is another story to tell.
That's so cool. You just want movies to be made from this, right?
Yeah, I don't know. Movies aren't. The book's always better than the movie.
Books are always
except for that one I was telling you the other day. So I forget the name of it, but the movie is better than the book.
It does occasionally happen. Usually I find that movies that are made out of short stories tend to be better because you can develop, there's so much more story there you can develop and things you can put into it. But movies from big, thick novels generally are you're gonna miss some details. You're gonna miss an important scene. I mean, they just can't do it in 2 hours or 3 hours. So,
what I find too is when I watch a movie rather than reading a book, I lose more of the character. You just can't develop the characters' thoughts and ideas like you do in a book.
That's true. And you also have the perception, the difference in perception. When you're reading a book, you get those feelings and motivations and everything right there on the page in front of you. When you're watching it on a movie, you're depending on whoever wrote the screenplay, you're depending on the actor, you're depending on the director on how they want to present that scene, and you lose a lot of that backstory, a lot of that emotional connection to the character. And which is not to say it can't be a good movie, but it's just it's filtered. You're not getting it firsthand.
It's an abridged version of the book. And you never, at least I never, ever listened to an abridged book on tape. I just told you how old I am. Never listened to an abridged version.
Sandi, do you have a favorite novel or favorite author?
Oh, I read so much. I don't think I could pick just one. I love writers like Nancy Collins, Storm Constantine, Jacqueline Carey, J.K. Rowling. I would love to sit down and ask J.K. Rowling how far she had planned out her Harry Potter series when she started writing it. Did she have all 10 books or all 7 books planned out, or did she just develop it on the fly as she went along? I'd love to know that. Nobody's ever asked her that. But, Anne Rice has been an influence. I read a lot of Stephen King when I was a kid. And, classic authors, too. I love Jane Austen, all sorts of English literature. To just pick an author. When I was 12 years old, Stephen King was the coolest guy on the block, man. Christine, The Stand. It was my all-time favorite Stephen King novel. So
they were long books. I had a hard time with them. They were
yeah.
really long books.
But they were good stories. So
real quick, but are you ever in your characters? Are you ever part of one of your characters?
I would have to say that there's probably a little bit of me in all of my characters. There's some little aspect that I identify with that allows me to create the character. Desirata, because I role-played her for so many years, is obviously I'm very, very connected to her. And Silver, too. There's a lot of things about her that I see in myself. And I tend to base my other characters, if I'm stumped for creating a character, I'll base it on someone I know. Sometimes I know right away when I create a character who it's going to be. And sometimes I'll have to, kind of search through the data banks and think of who would be a good fit for this character. My friends always ask me if they were going to make a movie out of your book, who would you cast? And we used to.
Oh, that's great. That's a great game to play, actually.
And we used to do that in college. I had a bunch of friends. We were all big comic book fans. We all loved the X-Men. And we said, if they ever made an X-Men movie, who would you cast? And we all agreed that Patrick Stewart would be Professor X. And we were right about that one. So we got that one right. But it's the same kind of thing. I've based characters on, actors, on people that I knew personally, on, some just for the appearance and some for the personality. And I find it interesting that when I do tell somebody, hey, so-and-so in the book is based on you, they're like, really? I would never have guessed that. And it shows you how different your perception of yourself is from the perception of other people. I had one friend who I said, can you guess which character you are? And he took like 3 or 4 guesses, never came up with it. And I finally had to tell him.
Really? That's interesting.
Yes, that's true. That's just great. Yeah. I love art.
Yeah, what an insight into the way we perceive ourselves is not always the way others see us.
Exactly.
Wow.
So Chasing Shadows, I must tell you, and you're going to be very disappointed with me because it's the shortest chapter, and that's chapter 54, and it's called Saul and Mel. And I just love that short chapter. It was so good.
Thank you.
I love it. And they ended up being, and I know that's another book because they could probably certainly be another book. You'll need to read the book and Saul and Mel, but they play a big part.
They do.
So even it's a little weird in the beginning. But
the second story that's developing has quite a lot to do with Saul and Mel. They have a very interesting backstory that's not even hinted at in the book. So,
all right. So my favorite chapter, although every one of them was good, but that was just like, boom! I circled it. Okay.
Sandi, I'm interested in the challenges you face and have faced as a writer.
I was dreading this question. People at UNLV are not going to like me very much, but this is absolutely the truth. When I came out to UNLV, I enrolled in the MFA program, which the MFA program allows you to turn in a completed work in your chosen art form, whether it be a painting or a sculpture or a novel, in my case, instead of a master's thesis. And the academic community, at least the academic community at UNLV at that time, looked down on what they considered genre fiction. Genre fiction included everything from sci-fi to romance to horror all of these all the things that I loved basically were lumped into this genre fiction. It's not real literature. And I knew I was in trouble. My very first writing class with one of my writing instructors, and he asked us to tell about our inspiration. And of course, I mentioned Anne Rice, who at that time was international best-selling author. The movie with Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt had just come out and was a big hit for her. And he had no idea who she was.
Oh, really?
He just said, "Who?" And I said, "You're kidding, right?" And he said, "No, who's Anne Rice?" And I looked around, and everybody else in the room was just wide-eyed that he didn't know who this author was. But they were very much on realism and life experiences and humanitarianism and legitimate topics and things in your work for it to be a real work of literature. And so they would not let me submit Dark and Bright as my master's thesis.
Really?
They would not.
Oh, no.
They said, no, we won't accept a vampire novel. And so, and they actually did
But
me a
your
favor.
art is your art.
It is, but academics back in the day had a much narrower view of what qualified.
That seems rather snooty.
Well, they didn't want art; they wanted academia. That's the
Yeah,
difference.
okay, yeah.
They wanted something that they could torture students with 10 years in the future, or 50 years in the future. I mean, look at James Joyce's Dubliners. I mean, English teachers are still tormenting their students with that book. And not that it wasn't a great book, I didn't enjoy it, but it's a really hard book to read, And I think that he intended to confound students for decades with that story. But that was more their focus, had to be serious. And genre fiction isn't serious. Genre fiction is fun, and they didn't like fun. So anyway, I got them to, I went in to see my advisor, and I'll never forget, he asked me, "Why did you choose UNLV to do creative writing?" And at the time, I had been considering a couple of different schools, and all I'd had to go on, I'd never visited any of these schools. All I had to go on was the literature they sent me. And I said, well, UNLV just seemed more open-minded than some of the other schools. And he laughed and said, "Why would you ever think that?" And so he made some changes to my schedule, and I took a couple different classes that I'd been planning on, and he switched me over just to the MA program. And so for my master's thesis, my research paper was on the development of the vampire mythology all over the world, and its effect it's historically and modern on fiction and poetry and movies and everything else. And I called it Literature That Bites.
Yes.
Yes. And they passed me. They accepted it. I imagine there was some grumbling among the writing portion of the council, but they did pass me, and I did get my master's degree. So, and the other thing, of course, is at the time that I was first writing, there was no self-publishing. You couldn't just, upload your book to Amazon and be done with it. You had to submit. And publishers did not like simultaneous submissions, and you had to mail everything in, and you would mail it in, and it would take 6 months to a year before you heard back from them, because
Really?
it just depends on where it landed in the pile on their
Yeah.
desk, I have a lovely collection of rejection letters. My best one was one of the editors at Tor Books sent me a handwritten note on the standard rejection letter, and she said, this was paranormal romance had just become a huge thing all on its own. That had just become a genre, to use the phrase. She sent me a note and said that my book, she really liked it. She liked my writing style, but she said that my book was too paranormal for their mainstream line and too mainstream for their paranormal line, and did I have anything else?
Oh, wow.
And I had just spent the last 6 months working on this master's thesis, and I didn't have anything else. And I wrote her back and said, thank you, and I'm sorry that I don't. And at that point, I shelved Dark and Bright for a while and said, I'll come back to this, just focused on finishing school. And by the time I did go back to it, I realized there was another story that needed to be told to make some things in Dark and Bright make more sense, and that's where Plight and Promises came from. And so I'm actually grateful that nobody picked it up, because it's a better book because they didn't. So, and now, of course, self-publishing, anybody can publish a book, poetry, CDs, anything, and it's wonderful. It's hard as an independent author to garner a following and to get your name and your work out there and to raise awareness of it, but I have to say, big shout out to the local Mesquite community. They've been so supportive. I've had so many wonderful people tell me that they love my book. I've had people buy my book and bring it to me and ask me to sign it, which I did sign copies and sent them to whoever requested them. And this was the first time I'd ever had somebody come up to me and say, "Will you sign your book?" And it was a moment.
Yes,
It was a
sure
great
was.
moment. And I've even actually walked into a couple of businesses in town, and I walked into my doctor's office for an appointment a few months ago, and I went into the lab for a blood draw, and the girl that came out to do it, she goes, "Oh, you're the author, aren't you?"
Oh, is
I
that?
never get tired of hearing that.
Yeah. Yes.
So the Mesquite has just been they've been very receptive, and I'm very, very pleased. So I'm very, very grateful also.
Excellent. Are you going to be a brown bag guest? Is she going to be a brown bag guest?
I'll have to ask her.
I don't know what the brown bag is.
At the art gallery, they've had this is the 21st or 22nd year brown bag cultural series. So we have people come in and talk. Brown bag for over lunch.
Okay, so
on the first Tuesday of every month.
Oh, I would love to do that. That would be
it's
lovely.
A lecture series.
I believe everybody has a story to tell, and everybody should, because we need those stories. The world needs those stories.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's personal experience or some fantasy world you made up, or your version of somebody else's story that's now in public domain, that you can do that. I love that idea that people are picking up things like I think Dickens just became public domain, so people can write sequels to Christmas Carol if they want to, and things. And I love to see how it's not only a great tribute to the author, the original author, but it also shows how those stories affect people, and I find that fascinating. What would you do with Ebenezer Scrooge? What would you do with any of Jane Austen's characters or any of Shakespeare's characters?
I know, you have your partner and you guys do things, but do you find solace in quiet? Are you able to find quiet? Do you need quiet when you're writing?
I wrote the first draft of Dark and Bright listening to music. I had a playlist that I would play that was all atmospheric music or songs that I related to. There's scenes based on a song that inspired me, and just what that music made me think of, and things like that. Usually I write in the quiet. Usually it's like that, but every once in a while you need that little extra bit. I can't do anything else in the background like audiobooks or podcasts or anything like that. Nothing but music I can listen to. And my my partner's a guitar player, so usually I have his music as my background when I'm writing.
Great idea.
So he's over there in the next room playing, and even with the door closed, I can still hear what he's doing, and that's inspired a few things too. You may have noticed that there's song lyrics at the end of
there is.
Chasing Shadow. And that came about I needed the song for a specific part of the story, and all I had written was the first verse and the chorus because I thought that was sufficient for the purposes of the story. And he read that and he said, "You have to write the rest of this song." And I said, "Well, why?" And he said, "So I can put music to it." So he's actually working on music for that song.
Oh, has he?
So it will be a song eventually once he finishes writing it.
Okay. I wish he'd finish it now so we could use it as part of this. So, Linda, do you need, I think we've probably talked about this before, but do you listen to music while you're painting? Or does it have to be quiet?
A lot of times I like it to be really quiet.
Yeah, I can't be typing anything and listen to anything else.
Well, and it depends, too, for me on what I'm working on. If I'm writing a party scene, it's helpful to have a little bit of music in the background, just have that little bit of, or if you're in a bar or something, there would be music in the background. But if I'm working on a serious scene or a very emotionally charged scene or something like that, I turn everything off and just focus on that.
Okay. Can you tell us about your childhood library?
Oh gosh, I had the entire Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys collections in hardback. I was also a big fan of a series of stories called Encyclopedia Brown. Those came out when I was a kid. But I also had a lot of other things. My dad bought me a lot of classics, things like Little Women and Charles Dickens, things like that. I read anything I could get my hands on, and I really enjoyed it.
I remember when I was a kid, my grandparents would have the Reader's Digest, and there was always a story in there. Did you read that when you were little?
I did. I remember always going through my dad's magazines, the ones that had stories in them. The pride of my collection when I was a kid was my dad bought me a complete set of the complete Grimm's fairy tales.
Oh, really?
And of course, I'd grown up. I lived in Florida at the time, so I was in Disney Central. So I'd grown up with Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty and Snow White and all of these different characters that developed from Grimm's fairy tales. And the Grimm's fairy tales in their original version are nothing like the stories that Disney portrays or that you've probably read throughout the years. They were meant to be morality tales. They were meant to the evildoers get punished, sometimes very graphically. And that probably sparked my love of horror novels because there's some scenes in there that there's I don't remember which story it's in, but the witch who's the villain of the piece, they put her in a barrel filled with nails and roll her down a hill.
Oh my gosh.
And that's like really terrible, but at the same time you're like, yeah, she deserved that,
Oh my goodness. I thought my parents were bad to be. Jeez.
My dad would let me read anything I wanted to. As a result, I started reading horror novels and romance novels many years before I probably should have. So
Yeah, because you could say that Chasing Shadows is a romance novel.
it definitely has some aspects. It's a big part of the what drives the story. But I try always to not be. I like I said, I don't write romance novels. I've always thought about it, but I can't do it. It's too graphic for my writing style. So I try to keep it. You want it to be romantic. You want the reader to be in the moment, but it doesn't have to have romance novel terms and references to things like that. It just needs to be a good scene, and you have to feel it.
This was good. Linda knows I can speed read romance novels.
Yeah.
I couldn't speed read this.
Ooh,
Yeah.
that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I could not.
And I've had people ask me, is this book suitable for my daughter to read? And I was like, how old is your daughter? And they'll say age 12 or 14 or whatever. And I'm like, my recommendation, kids today are exposed to a lot of stuff a lot earlier than we were when we were their age. And I always tell them, read it first. Read it first and decide, because you know the maturity level of your child. I would not presume to guess, so I'm not going to say, oh yeah, it's fine, and then have you come mad at me because they read something you didn't want them to read. So the parent should always decide. The parent should also know what their kids are reading.
Sure.
My dad or my mom read every book that I read. Mom read the romance novels, and Dad read the horror novels, just to make sure, just so they knew what I was reading.
Sure.
So.
My last bad question, what's your go-to snack on a road trip?
Pumpkin seeds and beef jerky.
How come everybody I ask that immediately comes out with, yes, it must be a thing. But yours is the first pumpkin seed.
I love
That's
pumpkin seeds.
interesting. Have you been able to totally support yourself through your novels, or did you have a day job to support your art?
No, I do have a day job.
Okay.
I work for a company called NRT Technology. They do fintech for the casinos. Our casinos here have some of their products. They do the video displays for table games. They do kiosks. They do all sorts of things. And I work in their marketing department.
Okay.
So
wow.
I do the company newsletter. I do some of the social media and whatever else they need me to write. Press releases sometimes, award applications, things like that. So.
You have to do that from home?
Yep, I work entirely from home. So I used to work when we lived in Vegas. I worked in the office, but when COVID hit, we actually moved during the pandemic out here. And when they called us back to the office, I called my boss and said, it's not feasible for me to drive into the office anymore. And she said, well, you're doing fine from home. So
They probably get more out of you from home.
oh, absolutely.
I always thought that they got more out of me because work never left me. It was just around the corner.
Yeah. Well, and you don't have people popping into your office to interrupt you or things like that throughout the day. You're just in your own space, and you can get everything. And I always loved it when people stopped by to talk to me because you always need the break. But I also wasn't getting as much done.
Yeah.
So
Did any vampires ever stop in? Okay.
no vampires. No vampires. I kept an eye out while I was in Vegas because I figured where else would they go? 24-hour town, right? But no luck.
You writers are amazing. When Steve and I write things, he can write pages in the time that I'm still working on the first sentence and rearranging the words and seeing if it makes sense. And he's like, oh, yeah, I finished that.
Well, you know why?
Why?
Because I write it, and then I go to ChatGPT and say, make this better, paste, boom, there it is.
But
then I just have to go fix a few things.
but you still write really well.
I have to go on the record and say that I've never used any AI or any writing assist software in any of my stuff.
Are you trying to make me feel bad?
No, I'm not. I'm just saying. Well, I'm a two-time English major, and it's for me. It's very important that it all be my own stuff. Plus, I'm a little afraid of AI, to be perfectly honest. I've seen those movies. It doesn't end well for humanity. So.
That's encouraging that you do write all of your own stuff.
Yeah. Well, and you have to declare that when you self-publish if you
Yeah.
used anything. And I'm always very proud that I can say, no, I did this all myself.
And you know what? It's really interesting because when Steve writes something and sends it to me, I can tell if it's his writing or if he's used AI to help
you can
him.
absolutely
it's
tell.
really easy to tell.
Yeah.
I can.
God, I've gotten so bad with it. I'll write it and just always put, if I'm going to do a Facebook post, I write it and I'm like, oh, copy and paste. And it comes out with a few changes. And then huh?
It's a wonderful technology, and it's it's really convenient, and it's it helps you. I mean, I still use spell check every once in a while just to make sure.
Sure.
Although my problem ends up being that spell check doesn't like the names of places and people that I come up with, so I have to put them in the dictionary every time.
Oh, yeah, because I was going to ask you about that, but I won't. But
you.
the names you came up with, the terms you came up with, and Chasing Shadows,
Yeah.
there's so many of them I would like to ask you about. But
Well, some of them are based on real places or real, things I've taken from works of literature, things like that. And some of them are the thing about Chasing Shadow is that since I'd never considered writing sci-fi, I tried to put a little more humor into this book than I normally do. And I slipped in some little things that are references. There's some little Easter eggs in there that are references to the works of sci-fi that inspired me, whether they be novels or TV shows or movies or things. I made reference to some of those, and it's intended as an homage to all of these creators who came before me and inspired me. And so there's a little bit of that in some of those place names too.
yeah, it was good. It was an enjoyable read.
I'm so glad. Thank you.
Sandy, what's inspired you this week?
Okay, I was ready for this one. This has been a very challenging week for me. I found out that over the last few days that 3 people that I knew have passed away. One was a friend in Ohio, one was a relative, and one was another friend from Las Vegas who actually died a little while ago, and we just were notified about it. And that's always very difficult when you have to deal with one, much less 3. But the good thing that has come out of all of that is that I've gotten back in touch with some people that it's been far too long since I've spoken to, and there've been tears, but there's been a lot of laughter too, and that's beautiful to me that you can find beauty in the depths of sadness, and it also speaks to one of my underlying themes, that of love and connection and the relationships that define us and shape our actions going forward, and I find that very inspiring too.
Well said.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sandy, thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you for having me. I've had so much fun.
Yes, it was really nice meeting you. Who knew that we had an author in town?
Yeah, how fun.
Broadcasting from the Mesquite Works Steam Center in the scenic Mojave Desert, the Art Box sponsors thank you for listening. You can find us on Spotify, Samsung, iHeartRadio, Podchaser, and Amazon Music. Please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. We are on Facebook and Instagram as The Art Box. We welcome all comments. You can email us at artboxvv@gmail.com. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of its hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect those of our sponsors.